what I really want to do this evening is I know that you are all experts on this particular site and this particular proposal that you have concerns about, and I know that quite a few of you are developing a growing perspective on water issues, and as Mike said, they're not going away. Water issues are with us all over Ontario, and they are getting more complex. And so it's really important to understand that background context. So this evening I want to give you a quick overview of what the Environmental Commissioner does, describe the regulatory responsibilities that various levels of government have got, and let me just ask by way of background, how many of you this last weekend saw the Globe and Mail article about water? The nice article by Mark Hume, right? Very nice broad overview. Did anybody notice anything funny or odd about it? I mean, what I noticed was that you got the sense that everything happened at the federal level. Everything is regulated at the federal level, and that's not quite right. I mean, what he said was quite true as far as it went, but it is far more complex than that. So I want to give you a sense of the provincial role. I definitely want to walk you through the toolkit that you have in Ontario under the Environmental Bill of Rights, and then our latest annual report. We always cover water issues, but this year we did include a number of issues on water taking, and I'll sort of speed you through those as well. So, just as context then, we are often called Ontario's environmental watchdog. We are an officer of the Ontario Legislature, much like the Ontario Ombudsman, much like the Auditor General, much like the Information and Privacy Commissioner. So we all report directly to the Speaker of the Ontario Legislature and to MPPs. We're non-political, we're impartial, we're to provide oversight and comment without fear or favor on what the ministries are doing. And in our case, we've been around since 1994. Actually, as of today, Diane Sachs, an acclaimed environmental lawyer, is the new environmental commissioner. She's currently in Paris because part of our mandate is to oversee what's happening on greenhouse gas emissions as well. And she certainly has a passion for making sure that the public has a good grasp of their environmental rights. So you'll be hearing a lot more from Diane. I mentioned already that there is often this sense out there that the environment is largely the domain of the federal government. And so I include these slides in my talks almost routinely because I find it helps to remind people of what goes on at the provincial level. I mean, what the province regulates really is certainly water quality, but also water quantity. Furry animals, scaly animals, air, forestry, agricultural impacts, sand and gravel, mining, all regulated at the provincial level. And of course, the whole electricity field, transmission and generation. So that's very important to keep in mind. And to give you a bit of background, I mean, the Environmental Bill of Rights has been around now since '94, and at that time there was, not just in environmental matters, but generally there was this sense that citizens wanted to be more engaged in government decisions, and that there was this principle that decision-making would get better, as a consequence. And so before the Environmental Bill of Rights, certainly there was opportunity for the experts to bring the public in from time to time. But many decisions were made by best professional judgment behind closed doors because they knew best. And so there was no obligation to consult the public. And the EBR changed that, and that's definitely been a good thing. And so a couple of years ago, we had our 20th anniversary, but what we certainly realized then is that still far too few people know about their procedural rights under the EBR. And so we're really trying to get that message out. The tools are really there to make sure that you have your say on decisions that the government makes, and to be proactive, ask for new policies, new laws. If you see a law being broken, you have the right to request that be investigated. And also I'll be describing the appeals process for you. And as well, the law created our office as the oversight agency to make sure that it all works. So that the tenets, if you like, of the EBR have been really the ideas of public participation, transparency, and accountability. And I know that often when you're in a process for a long time, you can get kind of jaded about those terms, and they sound a little bit like blah, blah, blah. But you know, those terms are really the core elements of democracy. And so, and democracy, as you well know, is not a spectator sport. So, you know, these are really important, and they're woven right into the law. Another feature of the Environmental Bill of Rights is that it recognizes that environment doesn't just happen at one ministry. It doesn't happen at the Ministry of Environment alone. There are well over a dozen ministries that all have responsibilities. I mean, it's obvious that the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing that designs or does the land use planning or sets the framework for land use planning across Ontario has an important role to play. The Ministry of Transportation designs and executes highways, and every one of these ministries, you see, we like to call them part of the EBR family. They don't always see it in that friendly light, but they do have obligations. And so what I want to cover this evening are a few of the tools that work, that are within that EBR framework. And I will also say that there are also some tools that don't work so well, and I'm just not going to cover them. But we're happy to give a workshop about those at any time. So the key elements are the Environmental Registry, and then this proactive opportunity for people to submit applications, the appeals process, and our office, the research and the reports that we do. So that's really what I'll be zooming through this evening. The registry, it's a website, and it's administered by the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. It's an online database of all the proposals that the prescribed ministries are working on, and the ones that they're looking for comment on, and also the decisions that they've made. So it's a great historical database as well. And the way it works essentially is that by law you get at least 30 days as a member of the public to comment on a proposal. And you can comment online, or you can comment by Canada Post. Very frequently they'll give people more than 30 days for province-wide policies. It'll often be 40, 60, 90 days. And certainly there are also site-specific applications for approvals on there. Many kinds of water-taking permits, for example, the kind that you're interested in. Certainly not all kinds of water-taking permits, however, and I'll get to that. So the key elements of this registry is that you get to see what the ministries are working on, you get to comment while the decision is still in its formative, or the idea is still in its formative stages. You get to see the comments of other people, so long as they've commented online in any case. Personal information, so names are left out. And also they have an obligation to say how they considered public comments. So those are the core elements of the registry. Now it is a dated, clunky IT platform, and we have raised concerns about that, and I'll get to that as well. But you know, I say unashamedly, I say use it anyway. It's what we've got. It's the tool, and you've got to use it. You know, it's not that hard. So there's about 1,000 users daily, and we'd like to see more people know about it. I'll give you some examples of the things that are on there right now that might interest you. So these are not the site-specific approvals. These are these province-wide policies. You very likely know that the province has embarked on a cap-and-trade program in alignment with Quebec and with California, and so the design options are there right now. In this case, only for a 30-day comment period, because they're under an enormous amount of pressure to get this policy out the door early next year. Sand and gravel industry, there's been a long process of overhauling that policy, and this is sort of the outcome of that. It's happened over several years, and there's been a legislative committee. In any case, there's a 55-day comment period. There's always lots of links to background documents, so an enormous amount of stuff that you can read. And in this case, your deadline is December 15. Far North Land Use Strategy, 90-day comment period. So this is a strategy that in part plans to, hopes to protect about 50% of the far north, and to work in concert with First Nations on how to plan the rest of the land base. So again, you've got an opportunity to comment by the end of December. We've certainly recognized from the outside that the registry has got its shortcomings, and one thing we've tried to do from the outside is to offer this app. If you sign on our website and you would like to monitor a particular issue, it might be something that happens in your county, or something that happens along a certain river, you can put those keywords in, and you'll get the email alerts when those issues show up on the registry. So that should help somewhat. We often get asked whether the public actually uses the registry, and I just want to assure you that they do. I mean, it's usually a small community of informed experts that comment on things. And so, for example, on a recycling issue a few years ago, we had under 100 comments. There was a policy that ONAFRA had on wildlife and agricultural conflicts. They had over 200 comments. And every once in a while, a ministry will really hit a nerve and sort of hit it right out of the ballpark. In the case of the Endangered Species Act regulation a few years ago, the Ministry of Natural Resources got over 10,000 comments because there was a lot of concern about what was going on there. Another question that we frequently get is, what's the point of commenting, right? I mean, it's a fair enough, skeptical question. But we can say, with over 20 years' experience looking at how the ministries have handled them, we can say, yes, indeed, the comments are considered. The ministries do care. Very often they're getting a very thoughtful expert opinion, and it helps them to strengthen what they plan to do. And I'll give you just a for instance here, and this is a very recent one. This is a water taking permit for a gravel pit, and this is about 40 kilometers south of here. And it garnered over 500 comments. And in part because of those comments, the ministry imposed a number of conditions related to the monitoring of groundwater, relating to surveys of nearby wells, and a contingency plan, and a requirement that there be no extraction below water table. Now, I believe that there is also, despite these conditions imposed, there is also now a request for leave to appeal on this. But I use it as an example to show what citizen comments can do in terms of conditions. So overall, I just want to let you know that the registry can be a powerful tool. It is dated, and but it does work. And you should try to monitor it, or at least think of the keywords that you would like to have sent to your email. So now I want to move, so far this was the reactive opportunity for the public to react to what the government is doing. But you also have an opportunity to be proactive. And you may, in your, in the course of your work or your home life, see situations where you think, that environmental policy is just really outdated. Or that there seems to be the absence of a law. And or something needs, an act that is just wrong, and so you've got the opportunity to make that submission to the ministry that's responsible. And the way you can do that is that you and one other person, it could be your sister, it could be your roommate, you submit an application, and you can ask, for example, that an existing policy be changed. And so some real-life examples. The Mining Act, there was a request that the Mining Act be updated a few years ago. There was a request for a review of an individual permit to take water. We've certainly had requests that road salt, which is exempted from the list of contaminants, that's not good for the environment, and that ought to be changed. So those are some examples of the kinds of things that people have submitted. Or something that doesn't exist at all right now. Protection for the water of the moraine was one that we had a few years ago, or a land use planning system for Northern Ontario when that was not yet on the radar. Important to keep in mind that the names of the people who submit these are kept confidential both by the ministries and by our office, because often there can be sensitive issues and people want the protection of anonymity. But it also needs to be said that many citizen groups and advocacy groups go public with their submission. They will do a news release and say, today we submitted an application, and here are our points, here are the issues that we're raising. And so that's entirely up to the group. And in those instances, of course, we can also say who they were. And I'll be walking you through some examples. Ministries have the right to say no to these, and they do. They do, in fact, say no to many of them. So we've had over 600 applications for review over the years, and the ministries have undertaken only about 15% of them. So most of them are turned down, and you need to be aware of that. But when they are accepted, then the consequences can be things like new laws, or amendments to regulations, changes to approvals. And even when ministries do turn them down, there can be action, and I'll give you some examples of those. So let me walk you through this one. And in this instance, I'm sure that in the sand and gravel industry, the Aggregate Resources Act requires what's called progressive rehabilitation. And that's the idea that you restore sites as you work on them. And quite a number of years ago now, Rick Holt and a friend of his saw what was going on in the area where he lived, in Puslinch area. He said, I'm not seeing a lot of progressive rehabilitation. I got a lot of concerns, and he really did his homework. He was very, very conscientious, and submitted a really good application, I have to say, and said, the Aggregate Resources Act needs to be strengthened because this rehabilitation isn't happening. And so the Ministry of Natural Resources in that instance did accept that, did take it on as a review, and they considered it, and they took their time considering it. They took 3 years. But they did eventually come out with a whole set of recommendations for themselves. And the upshot was that there were new reporting requirements for the aggregate operators. The ministry inspectors got some new powers. The royalties were increased, and also the Act now applies to a broader range of Ontario. Now, does that mean that all aggregate issues have been resolved? By no means. I mean, in this world that we're working in, you know, it's a game of inches, right? It's definitely a game of inches. It's a long process. But Rick Holt, you know, he did real yeoman's work in this instance. Let me give you a much more simple example. So you may know that in some subdivisions, it's been deemed that hanging your laundry out is unsightly, and so there were prohibitions on that. And there were a couple of environmental law students who kind of took this on as a project. And said, well, that's really dumb. I mean, it's an energy conservation thing. It's a habit that everyone should be able to do. And so they submitted this application saying, you know, that shouldn't be the case. Clothesline restrictions shouldn't be allowed. And their timing was really good, because the Ministry of Energy was just bringing in the Green Energy Act, and they said, yeah, we can sort of slip that in. And so now those kinds of restrictive covenants on outdoor clotheslines are illegal in Ontario. Here's an interesting example which is quite recent. So in bigger cities like the city of Toronto, when you have intense summer storms, or any kind of summer storms really, the old storm sewer systems can't take it and overflow, and they're combined sewers with the sanitary sewers, and what really happens is that you have dilute sewage and vast quantities of it flowing into the lake. So it's called a sewage bypass, and you get this cafe au lait effect in Lake Ontario. And that happens several times a month in cities like Toronto, Kingston. Really, it's very, very common. And now we do have blue flag beaches, so that the beaches themselves are, you know, or you get some notification at the beaches. But there are lots of users of the waterfront. There's small watercraft. There's all kinds of people who would really like to know that vast quantities of dilute sewage have entered the lake, and they don't get any real-time notification from the city. And so for Lake Ontario Waterkeeper, for Mark Matson, that was a concern. And because the Ministry of the Environment is the regulator, he submitted a request saying, you know, the City of Toronto really should be required to let the public know about these sewage bypasses. And in this instance, the Ministry of Environment said, yeah, that's a good idea, we will do that. And so they are now working on this concept of new real-time reporting of sewage bypasses. Incidentally, this was not something that the City of Toronto was going to do voluntarily, because they did ask, right? So it was they did need to bring the regulator in. Anything more that you'd like to know about how to do applications for review, you can find online. We have these booklets. I haven't brought any along, but you know, it's all online, and so you really don't need the paper copies. A very similar process exists for applications for investigation. And the idea really is that if you think you are seeing someone who is contravening an act, an environmental act or an instrument, then you can ask the government to investigate. You and one other person. And in this instance, you do have to submit an affidavit saying that, you know, yes, you really do believe that this is true, and you need to provide the best evidence that you can put together. And this might be in the instance, for example, of chronic noise or vibration, people who are perhaps close to an industrial area. Or it might be an instance where you think you're seeing damage to the habitat of an endangered species, because that's against the law. Or where you're seeing impacts on water quality, surface water or groundwater. And again, the names are kept confidential, and of course in many instances you may have people who are neighbors to a facility, and so the issue of confidentiality is even more important. Again, lots of groups will be very public about this, so you know, you've got the freedom to do it either way. An instance again, in the Picton area, not far from Picton, has been a cement facility that's been operating for many decades there. and has produced very, there have been chronic air emissions, let's just say, very, very problematic dust and noise emissions. People's cars and backyards were covered, and the complaints seem to fall on deaf ears at the Ministry of Environment. And so in frustration, people submitted an application for investigation. The ministry accepted it. They also changed the staffing at the local ministry office, and so certainly things began to change there, and as a result, there were charges laid, there was a conviction, and a $350,000 fine. Of course, it would have been preferable to have had, the abatement and the compliance years earlier, but when you face a frustrating situation, an application for investigation can sometimes shake things loose. And I think this is one of my last examples here. So, we know that birds, especially migratory birds, will fly into buildings. They get disoriented, both by day and by night. And so that's been a long-standing concern. And there's this organization, a nonprofit group called FLAP, that has spent many decades sort of checking the downtown skyscrapers at the crack of dawn to monitor and properly document where the deaths are and where the hotspots are. And so that was taken to a court case, and in 2013, an Ontario Court of Justice determined that reflected light causing bird death should be considered is a contaminant under the Environmental Protection Act. And therefore the Ministry of Environment has the responsibility to regulate it. So using that basis, we had citizens that requested that the ministry enforce this, take regulatory action. I will say the Ministry of Environment in this instance turned it down. But when I released this report just earlier this month, the Minister of Environment was in attendance in the audience and told media later that in fact he was interested in regulatory options, and so he does want his ministry to now look into that. And so it's, this issue is very much in play right now. Again, we get about 10 applications a year, 10 applications for investigation, and about a quarter of them are undertaken by the ministry. This pie chart tells you that most of them deal with the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and a few for the Ministry of Natural Resources, and a tiny amount that deal with fuel management. The legislation that's most cited is a very powerful section of the Environmental Protection Act, which is, I don't know if some of you know it, it's Section 14 of the Environmental Protection Act. And that act is, it essentially lays out the types, maybe I've got it here, I hope I do, there we go, yes. So it prohibits discharge of a contaminant that causes an adverse effect. An adverse effect is carefully defined and broadly defined, I have to say. It includes injury or damage to property or plant or animal life. And so you can see that's potentially quite powerful. Harm or material discomfort, loss of enjoyment of normal use of property, and interference with normal conduct of business. So that gives you a sense of why people would be resorting to this Section 14. Other legislation that people will use are the Ontario Water Resources Act, and in some small cases the Environmental Assessment Act, and the Fisheries Act is not really an option anymore because of the changes at the federal level. So about a quarter of them are undertaken. Again, the ministries do have the right under certain circumstances, and they certainly take advantage of that right to turn down these requests. When they do undertake them, they may either lay charges or issue provincial officers' orders, which are sort of a softer form of charge. But even when they're denied, it may result in a site inspection, and it may be the very first time that facility has been inspected by the ministry, and it may be, genuine, genuine ignorance on the part of the facility manager that, they didn't know that they weren't to put that down the sewer, that kind of thing. So there is still merit in doing it, and in any case, it requires the ministry to draw a fresh eye on the matter, and that's important. Our office reviews all these, how the ministries handle all these requests, and whether they are, whether they take the concerns seriously, something we do often agree with the way the ministries handle them, but when there are concerns, the commissioner will also call a spade a spade. So there is a difference between this and simply writing a letter to the minister. You've always been able to do that, right? You've always been able to just write a letter of concern to the minister. But this process includes timelines that give you some protection. It includes our independent review. It includes the report to the legislature and to MPPs. And so it elevates your concern within the ministry, and those are its key advantages. So again, we've had people from all walks of life submit these applications over the years. We've had cottage owners and waste haulers and mayors and municipal councillors, First Nations, pop stars, and certainly environmental groups submit applications. And again, you can too. I mean, as I say, I think anybody and her sister could do it over a weekend. And you definitely don't need a lawyer for this. So the background information is on our website. And I'm wondering whether this might be a good moment for a stretch break, because the appeal rights, often I skip them, but I don't want to skip them for this audience. So